Well, welcome to another episode of the Coffee Roaster Warm-Up Sessions podcast. Friends, we're back at it. Episode, what is this, 96? 95? 96. Approaching episode 100 real quick. Just a shocking amount.
Yeah. Stoked on it.
We're gonna try to get a Q&A session in by episode 100. Chances are it's gonna be next week. So friends, if you're listening to this and you have some questions, everything coffee, roasting, brewing, business, life, philosophy, anything, nothing's off the table. Go ahead and either comment on the YouTube video, send us an Instagram DM, which is probably the best way to do it. You can email us as well, but kind of everything goes, and we'll try to get to all the questions. So send in your questions, folks. But anyways, let's pour some batchy. Let's get into this. I can't stop thinking about those bun crafts.
Those are fun.
We just did a little pop-up with a local nonprofit called Northwest Youth Services. They do some amazing work, and so they had like a little luncheon or little event, fundraising event. And so we got to serve some coffee on there. Served some Jorge Mendez Gua and some Wilmer Castillo Gua as well, which was super tasty.
Great.
It all. Yeah. It was a good time, but we kind of had to use, we did manual pours or hand pours. And then we also used some, a drip coffee maker that was already there. And it was like the most classic bun, like think like, this might be a little too much, but think like early 2000s, late 90s bun brewer at the diner with those nice, like classic, iconic round carafes. It was just beautiful. And one of them had even had an orange nozzle on the top. That was incredible. Like that just
decaf signifier. Yeah.
Oh, that was crazy. I didn't realize that, but that makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's classic. Definitely threw me off considering that you pour water in the top and then it goes through the heating element and just starts brewing right away. So water's not up to temp. We had to warm it up a couple times. Yeah.
So you have to wait until the coils are heated up.
Yeah.
And then once they get to a point, then you can, it kind of makes it easier because you just dose out, your dose, and all the water is going through right over the basket. But it's probably not the best. But
it was just tricky because then you have to adjust grind size to make sure it doesn't clog and make sure that it doesn't overfill the basket. So
you nailed
lucky.
You nailed it. You got lucky. The grind size was decent. The coffee was great.
Fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Ooh, that back end is nice.
Oh, that's exactly what I thought. Literally right when you said that. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Like dried fruit, cherry on the back end. I don't know if it's slightly under extracted. I don't think so. Yeah, I did throw you for a curveball. You still dosed 800 grams of water.
Yeah.
I did a 60-gram dose.
As opposed to a 50?
Yeah.
Okay. It worked out. I think this is
It's a little thick. It's heavy.
I like it.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine with it.
I'm a fan.
Oh, man. That back end is very nice. The aftertaste lingers for a long time with a lot of nice heavy sweetness, dried fruit.
Yeah, the back end's really nice. It's not super like intense on the front end. Yeah. On the front end, it tastes. I don't know if that's a brewing thing or a roasting thing, a coffee thing, but on the front end, it's a little, for lack of better terms, just a little weak in flavor.
Yeah.
You're still getting a little bit of. Like a sweet acidity on the front end, just a little bit. But it's not like super intense or.
It's like a green apple.
Yeah, exactly.
Like nice tartness, but it's a little big. Yeah, the tartness itself is like big. It's not, doesn't have like much flavor, and the tartness is just kind of like a punchy green apple.
Yeah, it also tastes. I could be wrong. It tastes a little hollow. Like especially in that taste on the front end, like that the first 70% before you get to the back end, first 70%, it feels like almost like a balloon where it's blown up, but it's lacking rich essence. And I'm not sure if could be because or maybe it's over extracted.
Wow.
Or it could be a
11 and
roast,
half for a 60-gram dose. So, and there's not enough water. I don't know.
So it could be,
could be either or. Yeah,
could be that. But that being said, I mean, I think we're getting better on our brews. 100 episodes deep, and we're finally nailing the batch brew recipes, and it's tasting decent. This is a Colombian coffee. It's called La Reserva. Yeah.
Oh man, I like the back end a lot.
Yeah.
That's
Coming to us from Canberra Coffee, local coffee roasting company here. They're killer. They're huge. They're great. So
yeah, this is a fellow drops coffee. So it's a tasty little gift. Big shout out to Christian over at Canberra for bringing a bag, allowing me to enjoy this coffee. It's nice.
Yeah, definitely like a green apple tart going on. So I don't know what they have on the flavor notes, but
it's an anaerobic honey.
Whoa.
Yeah.
An anaerobic honey.
Yeah. Did not expect that.
I mean, I'm glad you didn't tell me until now.
Yeah.
I would never have guessed. Like never. That's actually really cool.
Yeah. Notes of huckleberry, plum, cinnamon, anise, and creme brulee. Nice.
It needs a little more acidity, I think, in those flavor notes. But regardless, solid coffee.
Yeah,
so
a little favorite of yours, a little spice on the back end.
Dude.
No, God. Not that kind of spice.
Definitely not that kind. No, I'm not thinking of
cinnamon,
any.
anise. Yeah.
Interesting.
Nice. Sweet.
Well, folks, we had a YouTube comment come in a couple weeks ago from someone who asked about how do you keep inventory of your green? How do you take an account? How do you do accounting for your green inventory, especially with seasonality, especially with, managing different wholesale accounts. One day you could have 15, 20 wholesale accounts one day, and then 5 of them could leave, and then all of a sudden you don't get that back for a couple months. All of a sudden that, if you're expecting a lot of that green to move, it gets a little difficult, and so also if you're trying to serve the freshest coffee and keep it within a specific time frame, because we all know coffee quality degrades over time. It's just like every fruit. So if you're roasting a coffee, 6 months after harvest, chances are it's probably going to taste really lively, really sweet, juicy, and big. And then all of a sudden, if you're getting into like a year past harvest, a year and a half, your coffee is going to degrade quite significantly. And so that's when coffee starts to taste a little flat, a little dull, not as lively, not as in your face. You might see, sweetness lower a little bit, and stuff like that you can't recover with a good roast. And that's the scary part.
Yeah.
And so how do you manage like having enough green for the whole year until, the next harvest comes from that farm or from that origin, while also not over leveraging and under leveraging how much you're going to buy. Yeah. And that's a tricky dance. I think that's probably one of the more difficult things of being a green coffee buyer. Of course, on top of that, you want to make sure you're buying coffees that are tasty, that are according to your menu preferences and taste preferences. But before we get into that, we'll get into that a little bit more in our experience with that. Serge, what would you say? Would you, if you had to choose one or the other, would you rather buy too much green or not enough green?
Wow. I think too much green, because it challenges you then to sell it.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair.
I think we've had the experiences with not enough green. Those were not fun.
That's
because
fair.
I would rather have too much green and deal with that personally, rather than have to, especially when you have a standing wholesale account, and have to tell them that, hey, like, we don't have a coffee for you. That is way more disappointing than being like, crap, like I need to find another wholesale account so I can sell more of this coffee. Yeah, and neither of them are easy to deal with, but I think that I'd rather be the challenge of, hey, we need more wholesale accounts than we don't have enough coffee to fulfill the accounts that we do have. That's my opinion. Also, because like sourcing coffee is very hard. And if you have too much of a good coffee, I mean, at the end of the day, like I said, the only issue is sales, right?
Yeah.
But when you can't find a good coffee, then that's when all of the choices and all of the difficult decisions have to be made. And it's way too difficult to make those on the fly.
Yeah. There's also the difficulty of, when you have too much of a good coffee, well, at some point that coffee's going to not taste
not as good. Yeah.
So then you're running into like, do you sell the wholesale account some slightly aged green? How do you maneuver that conversation? And it's difficult. There's really no easy way. It's kind of like, hey man, would you rather freeze to death or die in the desert? It's like I don't want any of them. Sorry, this is horrible. And so I would actually, and this is good. I'm glad you said that, because I would actually argue the other way around. Because I think the good thing with buying not enough green, in my opinion, I think, is that you get coffee and you're serving it at peak quality, at peak tastiness, and the customers or the people who are buying from you, whether that's people, the folks, you guys buying it offline or wholesale accounts that we have, they're getting the most delicious thing that you can probably offer with your roasting style, with your skill set, with, everything that you did to get that coffee into the door. That's kind of where I'm sitting. But you're right, because at some point we did have a time, this was especially during, the pandemic a couple of years back, where, warehouses were really running out of coffee. We were reaching out to a few of our partners and they were like, sorry, we don't have anything. And what they did have truly wasn't great, and so that was not fun, because at some point you might be left with really one coffee on your menu, which may not fit for everyone, and you're stuck. So it's almost so it's challenging.
I definitely think it's okay. Well, it's not okay from a business perspective. Like when either you have too much or too little, that's not great for business. But from serving guests, I am okay with running out of green on our website. What my biggest struggle is running out of green for our wholesale partners.
Right.
Because they're running cafes.
Right.
They're serving coffee to guests. And it's a different story when you kind of can't fulfill the demand for a wholesale partner, rather than you just mark a coffee sold out.
Right. And sometimes that's all they're serving in the cafe.
Right. Yeah.
And which means scarier.
Like,
dude, now you're putting them in a bad spot, which is not great. And they're scrambling to find something, that it's, and that's the difficulty, is like, then you're scrambling, just like they're scrambling to find a roaster. I mean, when you don't have enough green also, you're scrambling to find, some green coffee. So let's pivot a little bit and think about, like, how do you combat that? And one thing I think that we are now considering more than anything is thinking about harvests from the different origins that we buy coffee from. So some of our coffee, like our menu usually for the most part looks like we have a Guatemalan coffee usually all the time. This past year we've had a lot of Colombians, and we try to have like an African coffee in there as well. And then for a limited time, we'll have an Indonesian coffee. And so what harvest looks like for us is that Guatemalans are usually landing, midsummer to kind of mid-fall, almost going into the winter. So those are kind of like when fresh harvests are landing. Of course, that might be sooner, depending on, logistics and stuff like that. And then you have Ethiopians that are landing late spring, early summer, midsummer. You're getting them late summer at the roastery. So that's when usually our peak, flavor, peak flavor, peak freshness coming in with those origins. And then you have Indonesian coffees that for us, this always has been landing one, like probably
like right now
February,
it's in
March.
transit. Yeah, it technically, Brett said, should be February, but I think this year delayed because they chose a different route, so it'll be like April.
And that's something you also have to figure out is what happens when you may have forward booked green at peak freshness, but then what happens when logistics, ports slow down, and all of a sudden now an extra month or two could mean you just went through 3 sacks of your last coffee, and that needs to be here like now. And so one thing with how we keep in mind with some green coffee buying is we take these, and Colombia is also nice because they almost have 2 harvests,
right?
So you can almost take advantage of that to kind of pack out your menu throughout the year. But mostly we're thinking, like, especially with our Guatemalans that are hot sellers, we're thinking, how do we buy enough at peak freshness, the best coffees, so that they last us an entire year, so that when we're running out, where we have maybe like a month gap or maybe no gap before the next coffees goes in, and then things are tasting just as great, and we need that to last us the entire year. And so we're calculating, okay, how did we do last year, and then how are we projecting to go next year? And projecting is hard because you can't. It's not always 100%. You're just you're really just doing an educated guess.
Yeah, for sure. And with that said, you're also thinking processing methods and how that fits in your menu, but also how they degrade over time. So you need to consider that.
You should mention what happened with our guats.
Which ones?
The Max Perez one?
Oh, yeah.
Our little deciding factor on that.
Yeah, so we had 2 gem lot coffees from Guatemala. And one, like, I absolutely loved. I was just like, man, this coffee just slaps. It's not extremely boozy, but it's got this kind of wild flavor to it. And then the other coffee was lighter, semi reminded us of like a geisha, but not exactly it, but complex. And at the end of the day, the 2 were completely different processing. One was a natural and one was a washed. And because of the price of both of those coffees, they weren't cheap coffees. And because this was only our second time buying a gem lot, right? Or first? Second time. We still are trying to define that market and who's willing to pay what price for a Guatemalan coffee.
Right.
So it would have been a very big risk buying a coffee like a natural that technically will degrade much quicker than a wash.
Yes.
I'm not going to throw out any like numbers here because I don't know exactly, but it will degrade quicker than a washed.
Yeah.
And if we can't move it at a certain price point, it would be very risky for us to buy a coffee, even though like I really, really enjoyed it. The other coffee I still enjoyed. It was just an easier yes than the other one.
Yeah. And that's something that, I'm glad you brought that up because that's important. And as much as, you might enjoy, those naturals, whether that's from Ethiopia or whatever, that's something you have to keep in mind is how fast is that going to move? And is it going to taste good on the last day that you serve it?
Yeah.
And so, that's just really challenging. And I think looking forward, you need to be able to, try to do your best to estimate how much are you going to move forward through, how fast is that going to go through, how successful is your business, is it growing, are you stagnant, is it decreasing, and then buy green accordingly while also keeping into consideration those peaks of freshness. And so you have to balance and it's not just about getting at peak freshness. You also want to buy enough for it to last you until the next harvest, or maybe you have or maybe you're fulfilling a certain flavor profile on your menu.
Exactly.
You need to figure out, okay, how long is this gonna coffee last me, and then if that goes away, how do I replace that for guests or people who are buying your coffee so that you can fill that gap? Like we've always talked about, like we always want to have at least one interesting big like natural on our menu. Okay, so if the Ethiopia is going to get sold out by this time, that we don't necessarily have to go back to Ethiopia. We can just find something else. But then now you have to think about that.
Yeah.
So either you buy a year's worth of natural from Ethiopia, or you buy 6 months and then expect to rebuy something else for the next 6 months. Here's the thing. Sometimes when you're buying in smaller time frames, you may decrease the amount of risk that you have,
Right?
because you're not sitting on the same coffee. You have to sell through less. However, the other risk is that you can sell out of a coffee, and then you have to do twice as much work to source coffee again, to go through the copying process. You have to go through this, through that, and chances are, who knows how long it's going to take you to replace that coffee.
Yeah.
How long does it take usually when we sell out of a coffee? How long does it take to replace that coffee in terms of the moment that we start thinking about it to the moment that it's dialed in, roasted, and ready to be shipped?
Yeah. I think 4 weeks would be like mega quick. That would mean everyone is like on par. Like as soon as we order samples, we get them within like 5 days. We roast them, we cup them within 10 days, and then we put in an order and get a coffee within 2 weeks.
Hopefully,
and start dialing
hopefully there's a coffee in that in those 5-10 samples that's a banger.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah. So 4 weeks is like super fast in my opinion. But I think realistically, with printing labels, with dropping a coffee, it's closer to 6 to 8 weeks of turnaround time. 8 weeks is also long, but I would say 6 weeks is like kind of that sweet spot. But I think also mentioning what you said earlier is if I had a choice of like running out of our classic staple wash coffees or running out of a natural that we kind of featured, I would rather run out of a natural because we sold it at peak keep those coffees, reoccurring wash coffees that are staples, and not have a natural on our menu. I'm totally like okay with that.
100%.
I'd rather be that than have a bunch of these like smaller lauded naturals that have degraded really quick and we're trying to move them but not have our staple wash coffee.
Right.
So I think that's the mindset then I approach with buying the quantity of green, because I'm like, I will overcompensate on a wash coffee and be like, we'll find somewhere to move it. That's fine. That's a coffee that most people like. But to then move a coffee that's like bonkers in flavor and way too wild and expensive is much harder. And I'd rather sell out of that coffee quick. Yeah. So those are the things. And then as soon as we're receiving those samples, that's literally when I'm cupping coffees. I know you and I have talked like, hey, we need to replace X coffee and we're looking for this flavor profile and we're cupping with that in mind already. But then when we start doing the numbers, we're also looking at our bank account because we have to forecast our finances to make sure there's a nice ebb and flow of money coming in and money going out. So then it becomes a strictly business decision in how much we can buy.
100. Wow. That one. Yeah. You just gave a handful, I think, of really practical tips for those looking for it. And it's a lot of things happening at the same time. You're thinking about seasonality. You're thinking about processing. You're thinking about how much coffee do you currently have. You're thinking about how much are you selling, going through. And then you're also now throwing in this curveball of what's in your bank account. How much money do you have? Do you have maybe potentially other investments you want to invest in? Say you want to buy, you want to buy a second roaster. So you kind of need to, doesn't mean stop buying green, but you kind of want to conserve a little bit and maybe spread that out in a certain way that gives you more leverage with your finances to do something else. All of that has a lot to do with how you're looking, how you're buying green, really. And I think, a big one, I think, is for sure you need to think about how long it takes you. And before I go there, first, I want to say is like a lot of these things are very personal and preferential. Yeah. Like this is the way Mira does it. This is the way we think about it. This is why we lean maybe towards wash coffees a little more. This is why this is why that. It may not be for a brand like, throwing out like Proud Mary, Push Pull. who are heavy on, naturals and everything else, they have a whole different system in place that allows them to grow and scale specifically their kind of infrastructure and their preferences. That's not for us. So if you're listening to this and you're like, man, but I love naturals. Hey, that's totally great. Just keep these things in mind. You just have to play the chess moves a little differently,
right,
so that you can win at the end of the day, But yeah, I think also that's figuring out how long it takes you from the day that you order samples to the moment that your coffee gets released. I think that period is, you really have to figure out what that looks like for you. Because I know for me or for us, sometimes, it sounds weird, but sometimes it takes 6 weeks. Because if you think about, like, it takes 1 week to order samples, sample roast, and cup. Let's say that doesn't taste good, which not always your first round goes, actually most of the time not. Second round takes another week, so that's 2 weeks already. Let's say you decide to order it. That's probably a week of shipping. You're at 3 weeks now.
Yep.
Your old green inventory is still moving.
Yep.
And you just put in an order. So let's say, on the third week, the end of the third week, you got your coffee. Let's say on the fourth week, you run a couple of batches. Roasts aren't tasting too hot.
Right.
You go back, you're at 4.5, end of the fourth week. You roast another batch, you cup, you're at 5 weeks.
Yeah.
You have your flavor notes, all your coffee information. Yeah. You're editing the label.
Exactly.
You ship it off to the label. By the time you get that back, you get your order back, it's 6 weeks, 6.5 weeks. Exactly. And then,
and photos for the website,
little
marketing,
update, end of 6 weeks. And that's literally the release of your coffee.
Yeah.
And so, that's a long process, and so that's why you have to play the, weigh out the odds of, like, do you want to buy only 3 months of this coffee? Because you're pretty much, like, you get a good coffee and you only have 3 months worth of it. You have to think about, like, you have to start sourcing again in 3 weeks.
Yeah. And if you bought like 3 or 4 sacks, your operating costs just skyrocketed on that coffee.
Yes.
Because you invested so much time and money to basically prepare 3 sacks of this coffee. When if you would have bought like a whole pallet of that coffee, you spend the same amount of time.
100%.
So there's a lot of things going on when you're trying to make that decision. And especially we've had times where we've had about 20 samples on the table. We cup them round 1. We pick our top 5. Then many times you've re-roasted them like 3 different ways.
Yes.
So then we take 5 times 3 bowls. So now we're cupping 15 bowls and trying to see, there was this in that coffee. So now a coffee that we might have like rated number 1 falls down to number 3.
Yeah.
And the
100%.
other coffee, because we changed up the roast, now tastes so much better. And then we recup it again, and then we boil it down to 1 or 2 coffees, and then make a business call on it. So like it really depends, because if you're having to sort through that many samples and that many rounds, it sometimes takes much longer.
It's almost weird to think that that's how long it takes. So as we wrap this up, maybe you want to share a little bit about why it might be healthy to forward book. With either the same producer, preferably. Why is it important to forward book from the same producer, from the same farm, year over year over year? How does that help you, and how may it be a little challenging? But what are the perks of that? Because we've been doing that for most of Mir, which is awesome. But it's helped us a lot, anyways.
Yeah, definitely start with how it feels for the producer. I mean, that firsthand right now after talking to Jorge. I've talked to Brett on the regular, and there's security for the producer. They know Mir Coffee Roasters is buying X amount of bags that is going to be sold. There's that security. For us, there's also security. We know that there's a guarantee and there's a promise that this coffee is going to arrive. So there's security both ways. That is super helpful to laying out the menu for the rest of the year. So you are actually we still cup when we receive the samples to confirm the coffee for sure. We're still QCing the coffee. It's not like we don't, but it gives that kind of plan layout. It's already set for sure. And I think the other thing is also like pricing. That changes the pricing because we commit to a contract beforehand. That helps us negotiate pricing, which is great. And it also, I think those are the two main ones.
In this talk with how do you keep inventory, the nice thing with, for example, our Guatemalans, we're buying close to about a year in advance, so until next harvest. So when we sign that contract with, our importing connections, friends, and with those, we're sourcing coffee usually from the same producer in Guatemala. We already have, we have some security in, okay, this is how much it's going to cost us. There are no, hey, you start sourcing and prices are at a certain mark, like when you sign the contract, you're saying, hey, it's going to be this much cost and I'm buying this many bags. So all of a sudden now your whole year, like it feels really, really nice to not have to worry about Guatemalan coffees for the rest of the year.
For sure.
We might have to revisit that, a little later when inventory starts to subside a little bit, but that's nice. All of a sudden now, we also forward book our Indonesian coffees. So our Sulawesi Desitoljuk, we know is going to come February, March-ish. So back in December, when we're forecasting, like around our launch, we're like, oh man, how long is this going to last? We're like, oh, well, this coffee is going to, like our Wilmer Castillo, the Margo Gipe, is going to sell out. What are we going to do there? And then you realize, oh wait, that's when the Indo launched.
Yeah, perfect.
And then all of a sudden you're like, now I can take a breather. I don't have to go rush and fit that 6-week mark. There's so many perks to that. The difficulty with forward booking, if you overbook, then you might be in a little bit of a pickle. But needless to say, it takes a lot of weight off your shoulders if you have parts of your year, of your menu completely taken care of ahead of time. Now you just worry about how do you store your coffee correctly? Can you roast your coffee well? All the other stuff. And so there's a lot of good things about forward booking and just committing to tasty coffee. So
and especially if you're just beginning with a roasting company, you're in the first couple of years, you're developing that routine. So I wouldn't stress about that. But once you have kind of a ebb and flow routine going, you kind of know how much of what coffee is selling, then you can start making those commitments. So definitely don't overcommit. That's not, especially if you don't have enough brand identity to where you can move things. Like, don't be overzealous.
Yes.
But also start planning on hey, I like this producer. I connect with this person. I want to start building that relationship. So start building those conversations and those connections. In the long run, they will pay off.
Yeah, and you don't always have to, go as far as, if you're, smaller, you're not ready to commit and sign contracts and all this stuff. You can always literally just know, hey, their coffee, they work with this importer, and their coffee should be in seasonality during harvest. You can always send your importer an email and be like, hey, I really enjoyed last year's crop. Can you just send me samples when it arrives to the States? That's literally all it takes. But the nice thing about that is usually, not always, but usually the flavor profile is also similar enough where, if you're trying to fit a flavor, a part of your menu, now that also helps. So not only are you scoring on having inventory, but now you can kind of almost depend on a decent flavor profile. So
That's good.
But that's how we do it. Doesn't mean that's how everybody needs to do it. Take it with a grain of salt. Compare that with your own system and infrastructure and all that stuff. So anyways, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Coffee Roaster Warm-Up Sessions podcast. If you're still listening, thank you. Please submit some questions for the Q&A episode next week. Please, the more questions, the merrier. It should be a good time. But that being said, folks, thank you so much for listening. And as always, as we always wrap this up with, reflect with. Whoa. I don't know. That's sorry, folks. I'm gonna do that again. As always, friends, remember, reflect what's good. Oh gosh. Whew. I don't know.